This is your host and moderator Aditya, back with episode 82 of PLF's Intellectual Conversations. This session is presented by Westland Publications, Mana Arts, StartupJob.in, and Small Town Bigger Dreams. This evening we have a very special guest, Mr. Farrukh Dhondy, and the conversation around his book Fragments Against My Ruins, a sneak peek into the amazing world of Farrukh Dhondy. So, Mr. Farrukh Dhondy, welcome to the show.
Hello,
Yeah. So,
pleased to be
welcome to
here.
the show. So, my first question for you is, could you explain the title of the book? Why this title, Fragments Against My Ruin? Because it's very interesting and it got me thinking.
Well, um, it was the final title we came up with when when I was first asked an autobiography. I thought to myself, "Hang on." I told my agent and West End Publications, the editor, I said, "Look, I've already written graphical books. They trace me from the age of 8 to the time in London when I was part of political movements and agitational groups and so on. The first volume was called Pune Company, and it covered my days in Pune until I graduated and then got a scholarship to Cambridge University, and for the first time left Pune, left India, and went out of the country to Britain. And so Pune Company covers those years and the neighborhood that I used to live in, Sarbatwala Chowk in Pune. And all the people I knew there came across there in school, in college, and so on. So it carries on from 8 to 18, 19. Then I wrote about Cambridge Company. That was all my adventures in at university and so on. And then the third book was called London Company, which was about my life in London, my life in Leicester, the political groups I joined, how I began writing, and so forth. Then my life took me into television. I started writing for television and became a commissioning editor. But I hadn't written TV Company. That would be a fourth book. But my editor said to me, uh, "Forget about the fourth book. Write about it in your autobiography." I said, "But those are the trilogy is a kind of autobiography." And she said, "No, we want the truth. We want your meditations on your life rather than a fictionalized storied account." So I said, "Okay, I'll do that." And I thought to myself, there are several things I haven't written about in those books. My interaction with the serial killer Charles Sobraj, my interaction with somebody like C.L.R. James, whose biography I wrote, a Trinidadian philosopher, um, my interaction with Vidya Naipaul, the Nobel Prize winning writer, with whom I was good friends. I said, those are all things we didn't, and the life in television, you know. So I said, okay, I'll do the autobiography. And I wanted to call it all sorts of things. I suggested 20 different names. After Chaucer, the first thing I thought of was the Scribbler's Tale, right? And they said, nah, not really. And then I said Parsi custard, right? A kind of mix up. And they said, no, no, not quite, and so on. And after 20 suggestions were rejected, I came upon two quotes from T.S. Eliot. And one of the quotes was, uh, it was from the line, "Let me too wear such deliberate disguises, rat's coat, crowskin, cross staves." It was from the Hollow Man. And I said, uh, can't I use the phrase deliberate disguises? And so they thought it over. And I think what they were implying with deliberate disguises means that you're not going to tell the truth. You're telling lies, because you're disguising yourself in different places. So I said, okay, there's another quote which comes from the wasteland, and that Eliot says, "These fragments have I showered against my ruin." So I picked up from that, and I thought, "Fragments Against My Ruin" will be a good title. Immediately I sent it off. They said yes. And what I mean by the title is uh, nobody can write a complete life. You can't write from the moment you were born all the moments. You only write that which will interest a reader. There are, days and days and years and months and incidents which don't interest a reader, which need not interest a reader. They're already parts of life. What were you ate for dinner? No, you write about what you think somebody won't read. So I called it Fragments. That's where the word fragments comes in the title. And against my ruin, because I know, and everybody knows that, writers, their reputation passes. The book is read this year, it's not read the next year. Perhaps, uh, Shakespeare and Blake and I don't know, maybe Rabindranath Tagore will last forever. But I'm certain that very many writers, including myself, won't last forever. So that's a kind of ruin. And of course, the final ruin is when you go to your cremation or your towers of silence when you're dead. So Fragments Against My Ruins, these are the things I want to say that have passed in my short and happy life. So that's the title.
That's an interesting title. So, since you've already written a trilogy of books, London Company and Cambridge Company, and I've gone through portions of your book, at least till the time you were in Cambridge and you were with your friend in that small inn, and the incident you had. So, when was the first time in all these four books did you first start writing your ideas or when did you first think that I should start writing, even if there were three books and then this book had more of your stories? So when was the first time you thought I'll just start penning down, put all my experiences together?
When they asked me to write an autobiography, I always think that an autobiography should not be just a sequence of events. It should have some kind of thesis or some kind of hook behind it, right? And in my mind, I began to associate my political convictions with the act of writing. From very early on, from my childhood in Pune, in India, uh, I conceived the idea that India was something was wrong with the country in which I lived, because I saw poverty on the streets of Pune and all over the place. You know, I saw the underdevelopment of vast tracts of India. I traveled quite a lot because my dad was in the army. So even from the age of 8, 9, 10, 11, I saw I saw that India was kind of unacceptable, that it wasn't reflecting the movies that I saw from the West and so on. And there's social injustice, you know. And it came home to me when I'll just describe one incident. Yeah. Uh, we had in my grandfather's house, we had a cook who used to go to market and buy the vegetables and stuff each day. And one day I saw him coming in through our front door, and he was followed by 3 or 4 boys, young urchins in tatty clothes, standing outside the small gate. And I said to him, Hukumali, who are those guys? What do they want? He said, they followed me from the market. They see who is buying what. And because I bought a lot of bindi, they followed me here because they said, Uncle, when you cut the bindi, when you cut the tops and tails, the end fragments of the bindi, please give us that, we'll eat it. And the cook said, I'll cut off larger bits. You won't notice. Your grandfather won't notice. I'll make the bindi, but I'll give them larger bits of bindi so they can eat something. They're hungry. That's why they followed me. It's me. And then, one sees religion all around in India. Yeah. And the religion struck me as being superstitious, non rational, and I kind of rejected it. My own religion and the stuff I saw around me didn't like it. And I made the connection in my mind between poverty and superstition and irrationality. And it kind of converted me to a sort of idea of society, socialism, Marxism, whatever you call it. At early age, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, I began to read those things. At the same time, I wanted to write. I thought, I'll be a writer. I want to write stories like that, right? And so when I was offered an autobiography, I said, somehow there is a connection between these, um, what you call it, these ideological convictions, right? And my desire to write. And in the life, right through the book, I explore this particular connection of sort of left-wing leaning, a sort of leaning towards social justice, and the wanting to write. And that's where my first books were born. So that's how it came about. Yeah.
That's interesting. And you did talk about one incident. Can you also give us another incident which kind of put these thoughts that you had at a young age, 11, 12, 13, even make it, they even made it more concrete? You talked about the children following your cook and how you viewed poverty. But what were your experiences in terms of you were at school, in college, and you had friends? So how did their ideologies change you? What were the conversations like with your friends
Okay.
in the
Let me
60s?
tell you about something very specific. I've lived in Sachapir Street in Pune, not 100 yards from Bala Chowk, it was called, right? And it was a mixed neighborhood with a lot of Parsi families, right? But next to me was a Christian family. In the front of the house was a Sindhi family. On top of them were the Maharashtrian Mr. Adav, the lawyer, on the first floor. And so it was a mixed community of all sorts of people. Now, opposite me, in a very small house, there lived a person called Khorshed Khambata, an old Parsi lady. Her story was quite interesting because she'd had uh, before the before independence, before 1947, she and her Parsi husband used to run an English book exchange, a bookshop, and all these soldiers and Englishmen, the Raj people, used to turn up in the Pune bookshop to borrow books and buy them and whatnot. Yeah, and she had two children, and then she got pregnant the third time, Khorshid Khambata, and when the child was born, it had blue eyes and blonde hair and fair skin. And Mr. Khambata, the husband, said, "This is not my child. This is a child of the sergeant that you've been messing around with, right? It's a bastard child. And I'm leaving." So he took his two children and he moved off to a house, threw her out of his house. She came to live in our neighborhood and she had this young son. And she called it a Parsi name. She said, "No, no, it is your child. I've never, you know, I've never had sex with anyone else," which is, of course, a lie because it was clearly this boy was half English. And he was called Aspandiar, Aspi, right? And so Aspi was 5 or 6 years older than me and the rest of our gang from the neighborhood. But he grew up in complete poverty because the mother had no money. The mother used to go out and try and do some work and this and live on charity and so on. She used to come to my aunt and grandfather's house and say, "Is there any food left over?" Right? She was very poor. And Aspi grew up. By the time we'd reached school, he was just in college and he couldn't afford a cup of tea. So we used to take him out, sit in the corner Iranian restaurants and drink single chai. And we'd pay for the chai because it was 2 annas. He didn't even have 2 annas. But he was completely convinced in his poverty by Marx and Lenin and Stalin and whatever. He was reading all these books. And at that age, I was only 12, 13, and he would say, "Do you know what Lenin said in the 22nd Agricultural Conference?" And I'd say, no, I have absolutely no idea. I had no idea who Lenin was and why he was speaking to the 22nd Agricultural Conference. But then he'd rattle it off. And we thought this was extremely impressive. So 4 or 5 of us kids were converted slowly from the age of 12 to the age of 16 to 17 to start reading uh, Capital by Karl Marx and the Communist Manifesto and this and that. And he talked to us uh, uh, about leftism and what India needed. And he'd read the newspapers every day from my grandfather. When my grandfather finished with the Times of India, he'd come and take the paper and read it and point out to us all the things that were wrong in the government's doings and so on and so forth. And that was an incident that did convert me to some kind of socialism, sure.
Are you still in contact with your friend from school, from someone?
Yeah. And and to finish that story, then went to college, passed college and very with flying colors, and joined the Indian Administrative Service, the IAS. And he came back to Pune as an assistant collector of some district or the other, right? And he spoke Marathi quite fluently, even though he was a Parsi fair-skinned boy. And then the IAS sent him to a delegation in America, some union delegation, right? The government sent him to represent, and he never came back. He he converted. He married some American dentist uh, lady and converted to Christianity and quit the Indian Administrative Service. Called his mother and sister over there, and that was the end of Aspi Khambata as a leftist. When I was at Channel 4 uh, as a commissioning editor, right out of the blue, after 30 years, uh, yeah, yeah, after 20, 30 years, a letter came from him saying, can you make a documentary about Hitler and Arafat and something or the other, right, as the devil's children? And I said, no, I can't. And well, he'd converted to Christianity and wanted to pass the message on. So, and
So what is,
he
yeah,
changed his name from Khambata to Come Better.
okay. That's
He
a
called himself Aspi
anglicizing.
Come Better. Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
anglicizing that.
That's the
Yeah,
story.
all right. That's an interesting story. But since this is fragments of your experiences, were there points where you felt that you could not remember the exact events? Were there any blocks in terms of remembering events exactly as they happened? Were there
Um,
points?
you see, memory is like that, and not just for me, for everybody. You remember something, and you think this is precisely what it was. You talk to somebody else, we didn't quite see it like that. We saw it that, and that's not what you said. This is what so and so said, and then it was not a block to the memory, but it was a version that your memory has preserved. So, your memory is a sort of showcase, and particular objects go into that showcase, and they may not be exactly what they actually were. But nobody can say that. The next person's version may be just as false as your own. So you pick up these fragments and then you see which ones are interesting to somebody else. And that's why you make an autobiography out of it.
So let's read from the first page of your novel as it goes. Stepping out of the terminal at Bombay airport with my rucksack and bottles of duty free, I was accosted by the taxi drivers competing for fares to the city. Uncle, 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 they called out. The culmination of time. So, can you talk about this particular incident? And when did you
Yeah,
first?
right. Being called uncle after so many years, right? Terminal Bombay Airport, Maraksa, was duty free. When the taxi drivers call you uncle, you think, my God, when I first came through this airport, right, to go to England, I was 19 years old, right? 20 years old. Now I'm returning after so many years, and you don't think of the passage of time. That it was the introduction, the first few sentences are about the passage of time. When you step out, a taxi driver calls you uncle, then you know that time has passed, and maybe it's time to write down what that past was. I tell you another incident. I came back from Cambridge uh, when I was, say, 20, 21, 22, right? And I'd grown my hair quite long. I had a beard. I looked like a hippie, and I was carrying bottles of whiskey. And I passed through the customs at Bombay Airport. And the customs wala said to me, "Are you British?" I said, "No, I'm Indian." And he said, "Oh, I wouldn't have thought it. Look at you." And I said, "Okay." And then he said, "You only allowed one bottle of whiskey." So I said, "Well, I've got two." And he said, "Okay, yeah, if you lived in England, go through." Right? And he thought I was some kind of foreigner. But as soon as I went with my beard, and so as soon as I stepped out of the airport, the taxi drivers came up to me and shouted, "Hey, Babaji, 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 Babaji." They recognized me as a Parsi, right? So I thought there's no disguising the fact that who we are. Took a taxi home. That was another airport encounter. But I've started from childhood and moved through the incidents which I thought would interest people.
So, in this particular novel, there are incidents of romantic interludes. Uh, couple of
Indeed.
them. I mean, there were a
Yes.
couple of them in college. So,
Yes.
could you just take us through the different experiences that uh, you had, your
The,
friend
the,
Maya,
the,
and
the
then
romantic ones, okay. What happened was I was in college in a gang, and in my second year, uh, a young girl joined the college, and she was unusual because we used to bicycle to college, all my friends, everybody else. She came in a car,
mm,
and no cars were allowed inside Nauroji Wadia College gates. But this car, with flags flying in front, was allowed in. And it was a chauffeur driven car, a Gurkha driver, Gurkha soldier was driving the car. And this young woman got out to join the college as an undergraduate. Why the car was allowed in, we found out. It was Lieutenant General Sen's car, and Mala was his daughter, and she was being brought to college and taken from college in the car every day. Yeah, and she joined our gang as such. So we used to go around, girls and boys together. You know, no nonsense. We were, happy friends, and of course, I was very attracted to her, and she was, for some reason, attracted back to me, and we formed a kind of boyfriend girlfriend stuff at a distance. She used to come to my house. I would go to their house, and the whole gang would go to their house because Lieutenant General Sen, her father, lived in a command house, right, with soldiers at the gate, and the soldiers wouldn't let us in. So we had to phone from a booth outside saying we've arrived at the gate. And she would come with uh, her Gurkha orderly, and they'd say, "These are legitimate guests, let them in." So the soldiers at the gate will let us in. We'd go to the Lieutenant General's terrace, go to his room, play music on his Wi-Fi, drink his whiskey, and mess about. Have a nice time, then go home later. So Bala and I struck up a relationship, but then I passed out of college, and I got and I came to Cambridge. What happened to me the months before uh, I went to Cambridge? She had left Pune College and joined a, a girls' college, a convent college uh, in Bombay, and I was there in Bombay on my way to Cambridge. And it was the monsoon season because I had to be there by September But August, it was raining like hell in the thing. I went to see her in her college, and on the way back, it started raining extremely heavily. So it was up on a hill. So Altamont Hill, and I got into a taxi, and I was coming down uh, in the taxi when there was pouring with rain, and there was a white man, right, a young man with an umbrella trying to shelter, but the umbrella was blowing away, and the monsoon was beating him down, and the taxi driver said to me, "Look at these guys. They used to rule us. Now they are suffering from our climate, from our weather." So I said, "Don't be bad. Yeah, don't be, give him a lift. Stop." So we stopped a bit ahead. As he caught up, I said, "Do you want a lift?" And this guy got into the cab very grateful. And young man, and I said, "What are you doing?" And he said, "I've just been to see my aunt, who's a nun up there." Right? I said hello to her. And I said, "Oh, so and where are you going?" And he said, "There." And I said, "Well, we are going that way. I'm going to Colaba, so I'll drop you at the docks and we pass by, And I said, "Doc, so are you a sailor?" He said, "No, I've been teaching in the hills in Simla, and just for a year, and I'm off now to back to Britain." So I said, "What do you do in Britain?" And he said, "Well, I'm a student. I'm going to Cambridge University." So I said, "Oh, really? So am I." And he looked at me as though, "What the hell is this guy talking about, right?" He said, I said, "No, I really am." And he said, "What?" And I said, "My name is so and so, Farrukh Dhondy, and I'm going to Pembroke College." "And which college are you at?" He said, "I'm at Queen's, and I begin at the same time as you." I went, he got off from the rain-soaked car. We got to, I got to Cambridge the next 2 months, and in the first week, I didn't think about him. I, made friends with people there. Suddenly, in my rooms, he turns up, Johnny Snow. Richard John Potter Snow. He turns up and he said, "Remember me?" I said, "Yeah, you're the guy I rescued from the monsoon." He said, "Exactly right." And we became friends. We had a drink together. We didn't do the same things, but he joined in with my kind of Indian gang at the time, Indian and English gang. And we rolled around together. And at the end of the year, or end of the second year, right, he said to me, "Look, I'm traveling by land to India." I said, "How?" He said, "Well, you take a ferry across the channel, and from there you take buses and you hitch rides, and wherever you can go, you go through." He showed me a route on a map: Germany, Belgium, Germany, Austria, Yugoslavia, and then finally Turkey, Iran, Afghanistan, and India. And we had 4 months to do it. He said, "Do you want to come?" I said, "Yeah, okay. If it doesn't cost much, I don't have much money." He said, "No, we'll hitchhike and we'll take our money." So we packed sacks and we came overland to India, right? Lots of adventures on the way, met people, and I turned up. And the first thing I wanted to do, of course, was land in Bombay and see Mala, who was still in college there. And so went and, took up again with Mala, uh, asserted our loving relationship. And then she said, "I want to come to England. Can't live without you. Let's consolidate the relationship." And I said, "How?" And she said, "Well, I need to get there somehow." I said, "Well, uh, you can get a visitor's visa, but that's only for 3 months." And then Johnny came up with the idea. He said, "Look, why don't I marry her? Then she'll be a British citizen. She can come and you can get." So actually, I mean, might sound outrageous, but without telling Lieutenant General or Mrs. Her mother, who was divorced to live with somebody else, what we were doing, Johnny married Bala in a ceremony, what do you call it, Hindu ceremony, and she applied then for a British passport, and she was, after 3 or 4 months, she was given one. We were back in England, but then with her new status, she could travel. So she came to England, and they immediately went to the court and said they hadn't consolidated their marriage. So the marriage was annulled. So she was a free young woman again. And then we lived together for a year. Then her mother came. They tried to put pressure on us. Said, "You get married, make her a respectable woman. Can't live with you. That's not the way to do it." So we did get married. So that was my first big, huge, tumultuous, and dishonest love affair.
So you talked about Cambridge, and your admission into Cambridge was quite different from what we have today. It was simple and yet interesting. So can you talk about how did the whole process happen? You went into a building and then you said, "I want to join." So can you just take us through that
Yeah.
experience?
What happened was I was living in London for a week, and then I knew that I had to go to Liverpool Street and buy a ticket, but I didn't know how to buy a ticket there. But of course, it was very much like an Indian railway station. You had to line up before a ticket office and buy a ticket to Cambridge. Blah. Now, the scholarship, the Tata scholarship, which I had got to go to Cambridge, was had dressed me up in what the Tata directors thought I should be wearing to go to Cambridge, which was a tweed jacket, nylon shirts or cotton shirts, a tie, and a baggy woolen trousers, which the Master Ji, the tailor in Bombay, had stitched for me. So I had this kind of clothes in my bag. In Liverpool Street, the people I saw first, who were all going to Cambridge that day, right? They were all lined up to buy tickets there. They were all what was at the time mods and rockers, right? They were dressed in leather jackets and, uh, you know, the hippie kind of clothes. And some mods were dressed in their mod. And I looked completely out of place in this kind of 1930s dress, right? And I felt stupid. But I got out of the train. The damn train stopped halfway for 2 hours. I was supposed to be there at 12:30 or something, and the train rolled in at 2 o'clock. And I didn't talk to anybody. These public school boys started throwing socks at each other and messing about. Nobody talked to me. I I found my way to the college, signed up, went to the porter's lodge, and he looked down the list, said, Dhondy, 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 yes, Mr. Dewey will see you, your tutor, at 12:30. So I said, 12:30, but it's now 2 o'clock. He said, you're late then, aren't you? Next. Really terrified. I thought, they'll send me back, to Bombay or what? So I went outside with my one bag I had, one suitcase. Waited till the queue had exhausted about 3 o'clock. And the porter was coming out. I said, can you help me? I was late and I don't know. He said, don't worry about it. Come on, I'll take you to your room. You have a room booked. So in college. I mean, it was these old 14th century, 13th, 14th, 15th century buildings. And I looked around and I said, who stays here? And they said, you do. I said, what? Said, you're in the building at the back. So he took me up. I didn't know what to do, but my neighbor, a guy in the room next to me, came up and said, you're Farrukh Dhondy, right. I've seen your name on the board, and good, I'm Michael Beresford Summers. And I said, look, I'm in a bit of trouble. I was late for my tutor's meeting. He said, don't worry about it. Write him a note, put it in his pigeonhole. I said, what's a pigeonhole? He said, go to the senior common room, and there are boxes there with names on them. I said, I don't have any letter paper. He said, go and buy something from Woolies. I said, what's Woolies? He said, Woolworths, it's a shop. Yeah, I had some money in my pocket, some pounds, went, bought this, wrote a note, to 10 notes, tore them up. Finally, I said, dear Mr. Dewey, I have arrived and will contact you whenever you choose. And put it in his pigeonhole. Came back. Every 10 minutes, I went down to the to my own pigeonhole in the junior room to see if he'd replied. And after about 1 or 2 hours, a note was in my pigeonhole, said, "Dear Dhondy, you may have arrived, but the verb to contact has not." Right? And I thought,
Yes,
yes,
that was interesting.
yes, I'll see you in my rooms at 7:30. So I went up, and he was playing the piano on this oak paneled suite of his on M staircase. And I knocked, he didn't reply, he kept playing the piano. He was playing Chopin or something. Then I poked my head around the door and said, "I'm Farrukh Dhondy." And he said, "How very interesting," and carried on playing the piano. And my heart sank. I thought, this guy hates me, what? And then he got up and said, "You better come in then, Dhondy." And so I went in and I said, "Thank you, sir." And he said, "Don't call me sir." And he said, "Sit down." I sat down. He said, "Dhondy, what'll you drink?" And I said, "Anything, Mr. Dewey." And he said, "Don't say anything. Say dry sherry." So I said, "I think I'll have a dry sherry, Mr. Dewey." And so he went, poured me the dry sherry, gave it to me, and said, "Dhondy, you're a man of taste." And that was my introduction to the tutor. And it was plain sailing from then. A lot of people, when I called and said, to me later, what a miserable time they had at Oxford and so on. And I didn't concur. I had a great time as an undergraduate at Cambridge. And
That's
so did my friends, Daryl De Monte, Michael Mascarenas, uh, Zarid Jasawala, who became Zarid De Monte, Veena Moti. They were all friends. Statira Gazdar, Cyrus Gazdar, they went their ways in India. Daryl De Monte became editor of the Times. Mascarenas became boss of Air India. Uh, Cyrus and Statira Gazdar run a huge transport capitalist company. You know, great. We all have a good time, I think.
so, Mr. Dondi, you have also written television series and movies. So, what
That's
is the transition from writing a book to writing a screenplay? How is the transition?
See, I started by uh, I didn't have any outlet for writing, but when I joined the radical groups, there was a group called the Black Panther Movement, and they were extremely impressive. And they were a mixture of Asians and West Indians, mostly West Indians, but a lot of Indians, Pakistanis, Bengalis also in the mix, because our slogan then in the 70s was "Black is a political color." So, they used the Black Panther movement's name from America, right? Just to impress people and get people in the group. But by and large, it was an immigrant movement for justice. And they had a magazine called Freedom News, right? Which I used to write for. But we used to write all kinds of political articles saying how we should this and what revolution means and this and that. And one day, a philosopher called a Trinidadian philosopher called C.L.R. James, cricket writer also, yeah, he came to address us, and there were 200 people packed into this room, large room, but people standing up all over. And he said, "Who writes this newspaper?" And we said, "Few of us do it." And he said, "You write a lot of rhetoric, and you're not going to get a movement going with that. Write about what you do, so people like you will recognize their experience and join your movement." And we thought, yes, he's making some kind of sense. And so he pointed to a guy and said, "What do you do?" He said, "I'm a bus conductor." And he said, "Well, what do you do?" He said, "I go at 5 o'clock in the morning to the bus garage, and by 6, my shift starts. So I get on the bus, I'm given the route." He said, "Yes, what happens with the customers, the passengers?" Yes, some are good, some are bad. They come and fight. So, "Do you have any altercation?" He said, "Yeah," right, "of course." I said, "Write about it." Write about what your colleagues, what your bus drivers do, what other people in the garage do, things that happen. What do you do? What do you do? If other people talked about hospital experience of being unemployed, turn to me. I said, I'm a school teacher. He said, what happens in your school? I said, hello, a lot happens in the school. He said, write about it, right? So I began writing 500-word articles, journalistic articles about um, uh, about what happened in school. Like we had a disco, right, for kids. And some boys came from Brixton because they were jealous of some girl who loved somebody else and so on and so forth. And they, bad boys, they came and broke up the party. And it was terrible because the whole disco broke up and the lights were out and everybody was thrown out and the police were called. So I wrote that incident, 500 words, right? Other incidents, some boy threw a chair at the arts teacher. I interviewed him, said, why did you throw a chair at him? Said he was getting on my tits, all this, wrote all that down, right? Every week, Freedom News, the paper, would publish these 500-word stories. One day, after 20, 30 of these stories went out, a fellow came to my school where I was teaching as a job. I was teaching during the day. And this young gentleman in a grey suit turned up at the staff room door and he said, are you Farrukh Dhondy? And I said, does he owe you money? And the guy said, no, no. I said, are you from the police? He said, no. I said, what do you want? He said, I'm from Macmillan's Publishing and I read your stories in Freedom News. I said, how do you know they're my stories? Because he said the guy who sold them said a chap called Farrukh writes them, right? Because they were anonymous. So he said there couldn't be very many Farrukhs teaching in the Inner London Education Authority. So I went to the Inner London Education Authority, he said, and I found you. I found you, you're the only Farrukh on the register. So I found you, I've come to ask you, so what do you want? He said, can I publish these stories as a book? So I said, they're journalistic stories, they're not really short stories. But I can write you short stories. He said, you see, nobody writes about teenagers, Black and Asian teenagers. And I said, if that's the book you want, I'll write you some short stories about teenagers. He said, I was hoping you'd say that. And he brought a contract out, right, of his suitcase and said, sign this. It was for £200. I'd never seen £200 in my life, right? So I signed it, and within a few months, I'd written a stack of stories, which I gave to him, and it was published as East End at Your Feet, my first book, right? Then, of course, when that was published and sold, he came and said, can you write another one? So we wrote another one. And then he said, can you write a third one? So I wrote a third one called Come to Mecca, right? East End at Your Feet, Siege of Babylon, Come to Mecca. And then from those books, people began to, a fellow called me up and said, can you turn some of the stories into television? And I had no idea about television, right? So I said, well, television is a kind of medium, not quite literature, not respectable. He said, I'll pay you £900 a script. I said, okay. So that was the first actual television experience. I learned to write scripts by looking at other people. He gave me other scripts and said, you put action here, you put where it occurs, then you write that, then the dialogue, then the person who's speaking. And I picked it up very easily. By that time, I was a graduate of 2 universities. I could read, write arithmetic, and did it. Wrote a series for the BBC called Come to Mecca. So that was the first television exposure. Before that, he'd given me 2 trial things to write for another series just to try me out. So I'd written these 2 episodes for something called Empire Road. And then he asked me to write my own series. So that's how BBC started. Then, of course, didn't look back. everything was luck, right place, right time. You know, it really is. It's a question of luck.
So, Mr. Farrukh,
Sorry,
we've got a couple of questions from the social media pages.
certainly. Yeah.
So, the question from Devi is that what is your writing process and how much time did you spend researching, writing, and editing for your books?
And editing. Okay. Um, I don't have a fixed writing process. You know, um, I believe that if you're writing fiction, your self, your subconscious should work at it, right? You don't sit down and write notes first and say, I'll write this chapter, then that chapter. You let it brew in the subconscious. And one day you'll wake up and say, I've got it. It's come to me, right? Ernest Hemingway used to get up at 5 in the morning, work till 12 o'clock, and then have a good time. Get drunk, go away, do whatever. I can't do that. I write whenever I feel like it. And even if there's a hell of a racket going on in the house or wherever, I can still concentrate if I want to write. So I write when I want to. And of course, I set myself deadlines. I say, this many words has to be completed by tomorrow, by day after, because the publishers are waiting or the director and producer are waiting. So I've got to finish the episode in the next day. So I set myself that, but I don't work to any particular time. It could be from 12 in the afternoon to 12 at night, you know, with a couple of glasses or more of red wine or white wine, and get uh, and get on, get on with that. Now, it depends on the format, If you're writing films or television, you're always subject to a director saying something, a producer saying something, and you've got to change it. In books, usually editing, the editor tells you, can you change this? You can argue, you can change things. If you think they're right, yes, you can change a sentence, you can add a paragraph, you can add a chapter if they want it, as in the autobiography, they said a little more about your television experience, please. So I thought of 4 or 5 incidents and set them off with a second draft and that. But by and large, the thing that needs revision is television scripts, because always producers say, you've got Jesus with 12 disciples. That'll cost us a lot in extras. Can't you have only 2 disciples? So you say, all right then. And or you argue with them. You say, okay, the other 10 won't say anything, so you don't have to pay them that much. These 2 will say something, right? I just give you an example.
Yeah.
You've got 5,000 elephants, in Akbar's army. Why can't we have one elephant? And I say, okay, you have one elephant, and then you do CG, you do computer graphics, and you make them look like 100 elephants. So that's what they figure out. That's always so in television writing, film writing.
That's interesting. So, Farooq, it was a pleasure having you on this Intellectual Conversations episode 82. And I hope that everyone listening and watching this particular episode also had a great time. And
Good.
for so just to reiterate, if you have to, you don't need to have a writing process. It all depends on your subconscious, when you want to write, and when the ideas start flowing, just start writing. So
Yes.
that's basic uh, idea to write. That's the basics. Even I also have a similar process. I don't sit down at 5 a.m. and write for 7 hours. I'll
Yes.
have an idea after this program, and I'll write something,
Yeah.
even if it's 10 words, and then I'll write after 10 days. I think
Right.
there's no need to put pressure on yourself to write. Of course, there are deadlines and everything,
Yes.
but that's a different thing. But still, it's all about when you want to write. Like I did write a
Exactly.
few words today,
Quite
and I've
right.
set a deadline
Quite
for
so.
myself.
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
I also
Yeah.
have a different process. I think that it's when you want to write, if the ideas come, write. And for that, read a lot, because unless you don't read, how will you write? And unless you don't experience, even if it's fiction or non-fiction, you still have to read others and then write your own viewpoint. So that's what my process is. as far as
Absolutely. Quite, yeah, yeah, yeah. Similar. Yeah.
all right. So just to for all the viewers who are interested in the book, this is the book, and I've read around maybe
Yeah.
20% of the book. And so if you are interested, you can purchase a hard copy or a soft copy. It's available on Amazon, and do go through the book, and you'll get to know a lot of things of the events of 40s, 50s, 60s from the point of view of what Farooq saw. And you can also talk to your grandparents what they saw, and you can have a comparison, maybe
Yes.
different points from different people. Because we
Okay.
weren't there, so we are depending on Farooq to tell us what happened all those years ago.
Great.
Thank you, Farooq, for being on
Okay.
the show this evening. It was a pleasure
Thank you
having
very
this
much. Thanks.
conversation with you.
Good.
So that's
Okay.
all from episode 82 of Intellectual Conversation. We'll be back with more authors, and we'll see you soon. To know more about what all authors will be coming next, be keep your eye on our social media pages, and you'll get all the information over there. Till then, from me and Farooq, it's goodbye and good afternoon from London.
Bye.
Thank you so much.